Hello, cryo enjoyers. I am here to be the bearer of good news. Layla's a pretty solid 4-star, so don't sleep on this character. In this video, I'm going to be going over Layla's playstyles and teams, kit, and best build so that you can make her strong enough to survive college. I don't really want this video to be a snooze fest, so we'll get into the meat of the video soon, but real quick, right before we get started, I just want to let you guys know I go live on Twitch a few days a week at twitch.tv/Braxophone. So if you're interested in my type of content, or if you just want to come watch some live gameplay, come check it out. Link's gonna be in the description and the pinned comment. And with all that being said, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about Layla. First off, I want to talk about Layla's playstyles and teams just so you sort of know what you're getting yourself into. After my testing and some theory crafting, there's only a few uses for Layla, but she's pretty good in those teams. The first one I want to talk about is actually Mono Cryo. Now, a lot of players have actually played Mono Cryo before. Ever since Shenhe came out, it became a much better team because she allows you to get much higher damage on all of your cryo units, even if they're not meant to be damage dealers. And in this case, Layla sort of functions that way. In this example, where I run Layla, Shenhe, Ayaka, and Kazuha, you get a lot of cryo damage coming out from multiple sources. Ayaka will be the most damage in this team. However, you're going to be getting bonus damage from Shenhe added to your Layla, your Ayaka, and your Kazuha. And Kazuha will also help buff cryo damage across the board and debuff cryo resistance from enemies. So all in all, this is just a good way to play Mono Cryo with a shield and deal some solid bonus damage as well. The main downside of this team would be if you're being countered by enemy types, because obviously if something's immune to cryo, like in the current Abyss, there's cryo specters, you have to use Ayaka's uninfused normal and charged attacks, which can be a pain in the butt and honestly just not very good. So that would be the downside of this team, but overall it's a pretty fun team and it makes Layla work well. The second playstyle you sort of have for Layla is a freeze playstyle, which is essentially the same thing as Mono Cryo, except you're actually freezing the enemies. So the idea here is that you're just getting a little bit more convenience. You're not using Shenhe in this team actively, so you're not getting as much Layla damage, but she can provide pretty solid cryo application, which can allow you to freeze enemies consistently, alongside whatever other cryo unit you're playing and whatever other hydro you have. Kazuha is also going to lower enemy cryo resistance and buff your cryo damage as he does, and with a team like this, you have a pretty solid setup. Now, the third playstyle for Layla that I think is actually pretty fun is a Vape Melt setup. Now, Vape Melt has traditionally been not very good in comparison to some of the other top options, and the main reason isn't actually because Melt itself is bad, but there aren't cryo characters that have solid enough cryo application to keep up with a forward Melt, and on top of that, you would usually have to remove another supporting character that would increase that team's damage, and that's still technically the same. Nothing has really changed from that, but the nice thing is that Layla provides a shield and pretty solid cryo application when you have her burst active. So the way this team works is that you're applying hydro to enemies and you're going to have hydro on them at all times. Even though you're going to be vaporizing, there's going to be enough hydro output from Xingqiu, and if you're running double hydro, Yelan as well, to where enemies will still be left with a hydro aura. And what that means is as soon as they come in contact with cryo, they're going to freeze, which means that on occasion, instead of just a normal vaporize, you're going to be getting a melt instead. And that effectively is going to make your main damage dealer, which is going to be a pyro unit, get the 2x multiplier instead of a 1.5x multiplier. This team's not necessarily a strict upgrade meta-wise, however, it's a pretty solid way to play Layla, and she's a decent unit for it. You can also use her in Superconduct as well with just any electro unit and physical damage dealer, and that's pretty solid. These are going to be sort of the main playstyles you have Layla for. So next up, let me tell you exactly what she does and give you sort of a detailed overview of her kit. First off, her skill is a shield that deals damage on the cast. The cast is going to have normal scaling damage. It's not based off of HP. However, the shield itself does have HP scaling. It should be noted that the shield is much stronger than Diona's by the time you're done investing in Layla. If you give them equal investment, Layla's going to be stronger than Diona. However, Layla can have more invested into her shield than Diona can, and you'll learn why in just a moment. Now, when you have the shield active, you're going to generate these little stars that deal small hits of damage once you have all 4. Now, when I say small hits of damage, I mean are pretty small hits of damage. Unless you have Shenhe or you're reverse melting, the damage from these isn't going to be that significant. The shield lasts for 12 seconds, which is pretty standard uptime for shields, and the stars from her shield that are going to hit enemies generate 1 energy with a small cooldown. In fact, to be more specific, you can basically get 1 to 2 energy particles per wave of stars, and the cooldown is actually based on star hits as opposed to strictly a time cooldown. Now, one thing I do really like about this is that you're going to be generating stars even if if you're not having Layla on the field, which means essentially you are going to be using her as a pseudo cryo battery. Her battery's not going to be insanely good because the amount of particles she's generating isn't that great. However, the fact that it does work off field means that if you have another cryo unit on field, they're picking up those cryo particles directly, and that actually gets better with her burst, which I'll talk about in a second. When you unlock Layla's first passive, it's going to give her a shield strength buff over time. After 4 stars hit, you'll have 24% more shield strength. And with her second passive, the stars that can be shot out of the shield get bonus scaling based on her max HP, which effectively makes the damage from them scaling on HP as well. This will affect how we build her later. For Layla's burst, it's a giant field that constantly deals projectile cryo damage. Now, the damage, like I said, it's not insanely high by itself. The cryo damage is called Starlight Slugs. They deal damage based on Layla's max HP, which makes Layla a primarily HP scaling character. If you have Layla's shield active, when one of the slugs hits an enemy, it generates a star within her shield, which can help her deal more frequent skill damage, cryo application, and also increase the rate of cryo energy generation. Her burst lasts for 12 seconds and has a 12-second cooldown with only a low 40 energy cost, which means it's going to be pretty easy to have near 100% uptime on her if that's what you want to do. Lastly, for talent priority, just level her skill over her burst, but level both of them by the end. Layla is a super easy character to learn and does get quite a bit of value if you invest into her, but she can be even better at C6 or just with Constellations in general. So real quick, before we talk about artifacts and weapons, I want to go over her Constellations. Layla's Constellations aren't game-changing, but they do help her out a decent bit. Her Constellation 1 is similar to Diona's second Constellation. It basically just gives your shield a buff and lets Layla give shields to other players in co-op. They're not as strong as the original, but it can be a nice supporting ability. Her C2 is actually one of her best though. It gives her 1 energy back for every shield star to hit an enemy, which can effectively remove any energy requirements that she may have had before. C3 increases her skill level by 3. C4 is a pretty good constellation as well. It effectively gives your characters a normal or charged attack buff after her stars fire off, but it's only for 1 hit. If that hit is AoE, it will affect all of the enemies, but the window of damage is 0.05 seconds, so it will wear off immediately after the damage is dealt. Good for increasing your on-field character's damage, but again, not super game-changing. C5 is a burst upgrade, and C6 is basically just a blanket buff to Layla. All of her stars from her skill and burst have increased damage, and the interval between the creation of stars from her shield is decreased, meaning that you can hit more star damage, apply more cryo, and generate more overall particles. Layla's Constellations overall are pretty solid, but you don't need them to play her. I just really briefly wanted to go over them in case you're wondering how far you should go in if you're trying to get yourself a Layla. Ultimately, they're not game-changing enough to where I'd recommend pulling on the banner to get more copies of her. She's fine at C0. If you do get more copies of her, more power to you. Layla's artifacts are very easy, and honestly, I'm so thankful for that. If you're below AR45, you have basically one option. If you're going for a 4-piece set, you want to use the 4-piece instructor's set. The reason is going to be when you trigger an elemental reaction with that character on field, aka Layla, whenever you use her elemental skill, you can give your party an elemental mastery buff, which will help with their overall damage, and it's a set that only comes in 4 stars, so you might be able to get it without really even farming for it. You might just stumble upon it, which is pretty good. And if you can't get that, it doesn't really matter. You just want to focus on your main stats. The main thing being for Layla below AR45, just give her as much HP as possible so that way you have a very strong shield. However, if you're above AR45, you have a couple different options. Layla does 2 things well as far as artifacts go. 1 is she has a short cooldown on her elemental burst, and 2 is that her elemental skill can hit fairly frequently. Essentially what this means is that the 2 sets Noblesse Oblige and Tenacity of the Millilith are going to be very good on her. Both Noblesse and Tenacity are going to give your party a 20% attack buff whenever you meet the requirements. The requirements for Tenacity of the Millilith is to just damage an enemy with an elemental skill, which Layla can do pretty consistently. You may have moments of downtime when you have to refresh your shield. However, it's going to be pretty consistent uptime because it lasts for 3 seconds. And additionally, it's going to give you 30% shield strength on your whole party, which means that anytime you switch off of Layla, you're still getting a shield strength buff, which is pretty cool. Now, if you don't have Tenacity all farmed up, that's totally okay, because Noblesse is going to be also very easy to activate. It has a 12-second uptime, and her bursts last for 12 seconds and has a 12-second cooldown, which effectively means you can have near 100% noblesse uptime if you choose to use it. Both of these stats are very good with Layla, and honestly, I'm glad that we finally have a cryo tenacity character. And if you're playing in a vape melt team, you can actually opt to use 4-piece instructors here, even past AR45 as well, just because instructors is such a valuable set for vape and melt teams. The main thing that you want to get right above anything else is the main stats. Now, the main stats can change based on your composition, specifically whether or not you're using a particular character or not. In most teams, you're going to want to run triple HP, HP Sands, HP Goblet, and an HP Circlet. This is just to get the most shield strength out of her and to deal solid damage as well, since most her skill and burst are scaling off of HP. Her shield has the potential to be very strong, and if you do build for it, you won't regret it. However, if you do want to opt to build her otherwise, you can give her cryo damage or a crit rate or damage circlet, just depending on the team. If you're using Shenhe, you want to go with HP on the Sands, but then cryo damage and crit on the Circlet. The crit can be crit rate or crit damage as necessary, and the main reason you want to do this is because Shenhe is actually going to be adding a lot of damage to Layla's attacks, which is effectively going to make Layla dealing solid damage as well. This is the only case really where it's super worth it to build her cryo damage and crit, but if you're not using Shenhe in your team, I generally recommend triple HP. Nice and easy. Now for substats, I'm actually going to recommend crit here, and the reason being that she can do a little bit of damage if you give her a triple HP build and just make sure that she's critting consistently, and also because you might want to use Favonia's sword, which is going to require you to be able to crit somewhat consistently on field. But outside of crit, you just go for HP, and a little bit of energy recharge never hurts. On the topic of energy, actually, she doesn't really have that bad of energy requirements at all. She only has a 40 cost burst, and honestly, whatever you get in substats for your pieces is probably fine for her. But if you do want to be on the safer end, you can give her like 130 energy recharge. It doesn't really matter too much, especially if you're playing her in a full cryo team. You're definitely not going to have issues with battery. So I mentioned Favonia's sword earlier. Let's just move on to the weapon section so I can tell you a little bit more about that. As far as weapons go for Layla, there honestly aren't that many options that make a difference. So the main thing you're going to be looking at is supporting weapons because she's a supporting character. Freedom Sworn can be okay if you can trigger reactions, but most teams won't really have Layla doing this to an extent that matters. However, if you can get it to work, it's a really solid option for her just because it's a good supporting weapon for the rest of your team. Alternatively to Freedom Sworn, if you have the key, you can use that on her. It's going to have an HP main stat, which is going to benefit Layla in both damage and shield capabilities. And if you can get the passive of it to activate all the way, you can get an elemental mastery buff across your whole team based on Layla's max HP. So Freedom Sworn and the key are going to be solid weapons for her. However, most people are going to just end up going with Favonia's sword. Now, the reason for that is pretty simple. First off, it's going to make it so that Layla never has any energy issues under basically any circumstances at all. But the second one is that it means that you can use Layla as a battery for your other characters. Since her damage scales off of HP and there's not really a lot of options for HP scaling swords, Favonia's can be a pretty solid default for her. Sacrificial, on the other hand, while it does have energy recharge and can be okay, you don't generate particles when you activate her shield, you generate particles when the stars hit, so Sacrificial loses a lot of value in that case. Lastly, if you do have Jade Cutter, you can use that, and if you're using her with Shenhe, that can actually be an even better choice because it's going to give you an HP buff and it has a crit rate main stat. Outside of those, I mean this when I say it doesn't really matter which weapon you choose. Her damage is not going to be greatly influenced by anything but HP, and her damage is low enough to where it doesn't really matter unless you're playing her with Shenhe. Layla is a character I was really looking forward to because I like her aesthetic and her design is really cool, and while I was bummed at her personal damage numbers, I do think she's a pretty useful unit. I hope this video helped you guys build your Layla, and I hope that she's doing some really helpful things for your teams right now. If you guys are enjoying Layla, let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, everyone. Drop a like on the video if you enjoyed, it really helps me out, and I'll catch you next time.